The cold metal chair felt uncomfortable against Jake Morrison's back, but he did not move or complain about it. The room around him was white and clean like a hospital, but it smelled different somehow, like ozone and something else he could not name. 3 alien guards stood near the walls with weapons that hummed softly in. Their scaled hands and their yellow eyes never left his face even when he scratched his nose or shifted his weight. Commander Zexkar sat across the metal table from Jake, and his reptilian features showed no emotion at all. The alien was tall even while sitting, and his dark green skin had patterns that reminded Jake of a snake he had seen once in a zoo back on Earth. Commander's uniform was black with silver markings, and it looked expensive compared to Jake's torn and dirty Earth Defense Force outfit that still had burn marks from the battle. Jake looked around the room one more time and counted 5 cameras that he could see, plus probably more that were hidden. The lighting came from panels in the ceiling that were too bright and made everything look harsh and sharp. He wondered if this was how the aliens always lived, or if they had made it this way just to make humans uncomfortable during questioning. The commander touched a device on the table, and it made a soft beeping sound. Jake guessed it was some kind of recorder, but he did not care anymore about what they recorded or what they did with the information. He had already decided to tell them everything because maybe then they would understand what they had really done when they attacked New Denver Colony. "State your name and rank for the record," Commander Zexkar said in perfect English, though his voice sounded weird, like he was talking through water. "Jake Morrison, Corporal, Earth Defense Force, serial number 7749218, Jake replied automatically, even though he was not sure why he bothered with military protocol anymore. "You are the sole survivor from the human colony on Kepler 442b, the commander continued, and Jake noticed that he did not ask it like a question. "That's right," Jake said, and his voice came out rougher than he had expected. Commander Zexkar leaned back in his chair and studied Jake's face with those strange yellow eyes that had no whites in them at all. Jake stared right back because he had learned during the battle that showing fear to these creatures only made things worse. The alien seemed surprised that Jake did not look away first. "Your species interests the Galactic Council," the commander said finally. 3 member races have filed formal complaints about human unpredictability. The Nexari delegation walked out of yesterday's session when the topic of human expansion came up. They refused to discuss territorial agreements while humans remain unclassified. Jake almost laughed at that, but he kept his face straight. Unclassified. That was one way to put it. The truth was that nobody in the galaxy knew what to do with humans, because they had never met anything like them before. Every other species followed patterns that could be predicted and controlled, but humans just kept doing things that made no sense to alien minds before. "We begin the formal questioning. I must inform you that this interview is being transmitted live to representatives from 12 member species of the Galactic Council." Commander Zexkar continued, "Your testimony will become part of the official record and may influence future policies regarding human space." Jake nodded, but he did not really care about policies or councils or any of that political stuff. What he cared about was making sure that someone somewhere understood what had really happened on New Denver, and why 50,000 people had died defending a patch of dirt that most of the galaxy considered worthless. "I want to know why your people chose to fight," the commander said, and now his voice had a different tone to it, like he was genuinely curious instead of just following a script. "Our intelligence reports indicated that New Denver had no strategic value and minimal defensive capabilities. Standard protocol suggested that surrender would have saved approximately 49,700 civilian lives." Jake felt something hot and angry rise up in his chest at those words. The alien talked about the colonists like they were numbers in a report instead of people with names and families and dreams about building something better than what they had left behind on Earth. Mary Rodriguez, who ran the bakery and always gave free cookies to kids. Old Pete Williams, who told stories about the early days of space travel. Susan Blake, who taught school and made sure every child learned to read, even the ones who struggled with it. "You want to know why we fought?" Jake said, and his voice was steady now, even though his hands were shaking a little. "You really want to understand what happened down there?" "That is correct," Commander Zexkar replied. Jake took a deep breath and looked directly into those alien eyes that reminded him of a predator watching prey. But he was not prey anymore, and neither were humans. The battle had taught him that much at least. Then I'll tell you exactly what happened, Jake said. But first you need to understand something about humans that your intelligence reports probably got wrong. We're not like other species you've conquered. We don't think the same way or value the same things or react the same way when you threaten us. The commander leaned forward slightly and Jake could tell that he had the aliens' full attention now, along with whoever else was watching this conversation from wherever they were. Your people came to New Denver, expecting us to surrender because that's what every other species does when faced with overwhelming force, Jake continued. You thought we would see your ships and your weapons and decide that our lives were more important than our freedom. You calculated the odds and assumed we would make the logical choice. Jake paused and looked around the room again at all the cameras and guards and recording devices. Somewhere out there, alien leaders were watching and listening and trying to understand why their perfect plan had gone so wrong. The problem is that you don't understand what humans consider logical, Jake said. And after what happened on New Denver, I don't think you ever will unless someone explains it to you very carefully. So that's what I'm going to do. I'm going to tell you exactly why 50,000 people chose to die rather than live under your rule, and why that choice made perfect sense to every single one of them. The room was completely quiet now except for the soft humming of the alien weapons and the barely audible sound of air moving through ventilation systems. Commander Zek's car had not moved or spoken for several seconds, and Jake could see that the alien was beginning to realize that this interview was not going to go the way he had planned. Jake closed his eyes for a moment and remembered the morning when everything changed forever. New Denver had been quiet that day, with people going about their normal business like any other Tuesday in the colony. Children walked to school carrying backpacks and lunchboxes while their parents headed to work in the mining facilities or the agricultural domes or the small businesses that had grown up around the main settlement. The warning came from the orbital monitoring station at exactly 9:15 in the morning local time. Captain Rodriguez was on duty that day and her voice came through every speaker. In the colony, clear and calm, even though she was probably terrified by what she was seeing on her screens. All residents report to designated emergency shelters immediately. This is not a drill. Repeat, this is not a drill. Unknown vessels have entered the system and are approaching at high speed. Jake had been working in the equipment bay when the announcement came, and he remembered how everyone just stopped what they were doing and looked at each other with the same question in their eyes. After 3 years of peaceful life on New Denver, nobody really believed that trouble would find them out here so far from Earth and the main shipping routes. But Mayor Lisa Chen had been preparing for this possibility since the day she took office, and her voice came on the speakers right after Captain Rodriguez finished talking. Citizens of New Denver, we have practiced for this situation many times. Move quickly, but do not panic. Help your neighbors and follow your assigned routes to the shelters. Our defense forces are moving into position, and we will get through this together like we always do. Jake smiled a little bit when he remembered how the mayor's voice had sounded that day. She had been scared just like everyone else, but she had not let it show. And that had made all the difference in how people responded to the crisis. Within 30 minutes, the entire civilian population was in underground shelters that had been dug into the bedrock beneath the colony. The Vorac ships came into visual range. An hour later, and Jake had been on the surface with the other defense force members when they got their first look at the enemy. The ships were huge and dark, and they moved through space like predators circling their prey. There were 12 of them in the main group, with smaller escort vessels that darted around the edges of the formation. Commander Phillips, who was in charge of the defense force, called for volunteers to man the observation posts that had been set up around the colony perimeter. Jake had volunteered along with about 50 other people, even though they all knew it was probably a suicide mission. The observation posts were nothing more than reinforced bunkers with communication equipment and basic sensors. The first contact attempt came from the lead Vorac ship at exactly noon. The alien commander, who called himself Fleet Marshal Korek, spoke in accented but understandable English, and his message was simple and direct: human settlement, you are now under the authority of the Vorac Empire. Surrender all weapons and defensive systems immediately. Comply with evacuation orders and no harm will come to your population. You have 1 standard hour to respond. Mayor Chen's response had surprised everyone, including Jake, who thought he knew her pretty well. After 3 years of working with the colonial government, Fleet Marshal Korek, this is Mayor Lisa Chen speaking for the people of New Denver. We reject your authority and your demands. This is our home and we will defend it. If you want our colony, you will have to take it from us." The silence that followed lasted for almost 10 minutes, and Jake wondered if the aliens were trying to figure out if they had heard correctly.
"Every other species in the galaxy?"
Apparently just gave up when the Vorac showed up with overwhelming force, so they probably had never received that kind of response before when Fleet Marshal Korak spoke again. His voice sounded different, like he was genuinely confused by what had just happened. "Mayor Chen, you appear to misunderstand your situation. My fleet contains sufficient firepower to destroy your entire settlement from orbit. Your defensive capabilities are minimal. Surrender is the only logical choice for the preservation of your species." "We understand our situation perfectly," Mayor Chen replied, "and we choose to fight." That was when the orbital bombardment began, and Jake learned what real terror felt like. The Vorac weapons made no sound in the vacuum of space, but when they hit the surface, the explosions were loud enough to be heard from kilometers away. The ground shook continuously, and pieces of debris rained down from the sky like deadly hail. But something strange happened during those first hours of the attack. Instead of breaking down and running away in panic the way the aliens probably expected, people started coming together in ways that Jake had never seen before. Kids who were barely old enough to walk were helping to move supplies, while elderly colonists who could barely move were organizing communication networks from their shelter positions. Dr. Martinez, who ran the colony medical facility, had set up an emergency hospital in one of the deepest shelters, and he was performing surgery by artificial light while the bombardment continued overhead. Nurses and volunteers who had no medical training were learning to assist with operations because there was no other choice. Sarah Thompson, who taught kindergarten, had turned her shelter into a school where she kept the youngest children calm by teaching them songs and games while their parents fought to keep the colony alive. The kids did not understand what was happening, but they knew that the adults were scared, and they responded by being braver than anyone had a right to expect. By the end of the first day, Jake realized that something fundamental had changed in the way the colonists thought about themselves and their situation. They were no longer just individuals trying to survive. They had become something else entirely. They were a community that was willing to die for each other, and for the idea that some things were more important than staying alive. The Vorac bombardment continued for 3 days without stopping, and by the end of that time, most of the surface buildings were destroyed or damaged beyond repair, but the colonists were still alive in their underground shelters, and they were still refusing to surrender, even though everyone knew that the real fighting had not even started. Yet Jake opened his eyes and looked across the table at Commander Zexkar, who was listening intently to every word. The alien's expression had not changed, but Jake could tell that he was beginning to understand that this story was not going to end the way he had expected. "Your fleet marshal made a mistake during those first 3 days," Jake said. "He thought that bombing us would break our will to fight. Instead, it just made us more determined to prove that humans don't give up when things get difficult. We get stronger." The ground invasion started on the 4th day, and Jake remembered watching through his scope as the first Vorac dropships came down through the morning sky like falling stars. There were hundreds of them, and they landed in perfect formation around the colony perimeter, just like their training manuals probably said they should. Fleet Marshal Korax had obviously decided that 3 days of bombing was enough to soften up the human defenders, and now it was time to finish the job with ground troops. The Vorac soldiers who came out of those ships were impressive in their own way. They were tall and heavily armored with weapons that could punch holes through concrete walls, and they moved with the confidence of warriors who had never lost a battle. Jake had been assigned to Observation Post 7 along with Danny Miller, who was barely 19 years old and had never been in a real fight before. Danny was a tech specialist who knew more about computer systems than anyone else in the colony, but he had volunteered for combat duty anyway, because that was what you did when your home was under attack. The first thing that surprised the Vorac forces was how hard it was to find the human defenders. The aliens had sensors that could detect heartbeats through solid rock, but the colonists had learned to use the mining tunnels and natural cave systems in ways that confused the enemy tracking systems. Groups of defenders would appear from underground, attack a Vorac patrol, and then disappear again before reinforcements could arrive. Danny had come up with the idea of using the colony's maintenance robots as decoys. He programmed them to move through the tunnel system and emit heat signatures that looked like human soldiers to Vorac sensors. The aliens would spend hours chasing robots while the real defenders set up ambushes in completely different locations, but what really started to disturb the Vorac forces was the way humans fought when they were cornered. Jake watched through his scope as a group of 20 Vorac soldiers surrounded a small bunker where 3 colonists had taken cover. The aliens called for surrender and offered safe passage to the detention areas, but the humans inside just kept shooting until their ammunition ran out. Then instead of giving up, the 3 defenders came out of the bunker with improvised explosive devices strapped to their bodies and charged straight at the Vorac position. The explosion killed all 3 humans and 7 aliens while wounding 12 more. The surviving Vorac soldiers stood there for almost 10 minutes afterward, just staring at the crater like they could not understand what they had just witnessed. Jake learned later that this kind of thing was happening all over the battlefield. Humans who were outnumbered and outgunned were choosing to die fighting rather than surrender, and the Vorac forces had no idea how to respond to that kind of behavior. Their own species had evolved beyond the point where individuals would sacrifice themselves for the group, and they could not comprehend why humans kept doing it. By the end of the first week of ground fighting, the aliens had taken control of about 60% of the colony surface, but they were losing soldiers at a rate that their commanders had not expected. More importantly, they were starting to make mistakes that experienced warriors should never make. Jake saw it happen during a firefight near the main water treatment plant. A squad of Vorac soldiers had pinned down a group of human defenders behind some concrete barriers, and they should have been able to finish the fight quickly with their superior firepower. But instead of pressing their advantage, the aliens held back and called for artillery support. The humans used that delay to escape through a drainage pipe that led to a completely different section of the colony. By the time the Vorac artillery strike hit the position, there was nobody there, and the aliens had wasted ammunition and revealed their location to other human units. In the area, Jake realized that the Vorac forces were becoming cautious in a way that was hurting their military effectiveness. They were starting to expect the unexpected from human defenders, and that was making them hesitate at crucial moments when quick, decisive action would have won the fight. The turning point came during the second week when a group of colonists led by Sergeant Amy Rodriguez launched what everyone knew was a suicide attack on the Vorac command post. Rodriguez had been a professional soldier before coming to New Denver, and she understood tactics better than most of the other defenders. Her plan was simple and completely insane by any rational military standard. She would lead 12 volunteers in a direct assault on the most heavily defended position in the Vorac perimeter, knowing that they would all probably die, but hoping that the attack would create enough confusion for other human units to exploit. Jake had tried to talk her out of it, but Rodriguez just smiled and said that sometimes you had to do something crazy to remind the enemy that they were not fighting a normal war. She was right about that, but Jake did not understand just how right until he watched the attack unfold. Through his scope, Rodriguez and her team came out of the tunnels, right in the middle of the Vorac command area, and they started shooting at everything that moved. The aliens responded exactly the way their training said they should, by establishing defensive positions and calling for reinforcements from other units, but what the Vorac commanders did not realize was that Rodriguez had never intended to take and hold their command post. Her real goal was to draw as many enemy soldiers as possible away from other positions around the colony perimeter. It worked perfectly because the aliens could not understand why humans would attack unless they thought they could win. While the Vorac forces were focused on the command post attack, 3 other human units launched coordinated strikes against ammunition dumps and communication centers that had been left with minimal security. By the time the aliens figured out what was really happening, they had lost enough supplies and equipment to cripple their offensive operations for days. Rodriguez and 11 of her volunteers died in that attack, but they had accomplished something that no amount of defensive fighting could have achieved. They had forced the Vorac forces to spread their strength thin and react to human initiatives, instead of following their own battle plan. After that day, Jake noticed a change in the way the alien soldiers moved and fought. They were still professional and disciplined, but they had lost some of their confidence. They started checking corners twice and calling for backup when they should have been able to handle situations on their own. The Vorac forces were learning to be afraid of humans, and that fear was making them weak in ways that their commanders probably did not understand. Jake had seen the same thing happen to human soldiers who had been in combat too long, but he had never expected to see it happen to aliens who were supposed to be the most experienced warriors in the galaxy. Commander Zexkar had been taking notes during Jake's testimony, but now he put down his writing instrument and looked directly across the table. This tactical analysis conflicts with our intelligence reports, the alien said. Vorthak ground forces are genetically enhanced for combat effectiveness. Fear responses have been bred out of their psychological profile over thousands of years. Jake laughed, and it was not a pleasant sound in the quiet room. That's what they probably thought too, he said. But evolution is a funny thing. When you breed out one survival trait, you usually make yourself vulnerable to something else. Your Vorthak warriors had never met an enemy that made them rediscover what their ancestors felt when they were being hunted. The final 3 days of the battle were when everything changed, and Jake still had nightmares about what happened during those 72 hours. The Vorthak forces had been fighting for 2 weeks, and they should have been close to victory, but instead they seemed more confused and frustrated than ever. Fleet Marshal Corax had committed every soldier in his invasion force to the ground battle, but the humans were still holding out in their underground positions. Even worse, the aliens were starting to take casualties at a rate that made no military sense given their technological advantages. Jake was in Observation Post 7 when he got the call that changed everything. Danny Miller's voice came through, the radio sounding excited and scared at the same time. Jake, you need to get down to Tunnel Section 12 right now. We've got something that's going to blow your mind. Jake made his way through the maintenance tunnels that connected the observation post to the main shelter network. The tunnels were crowded with people moving supplies and ammunition, but everyone seemed to have a sense of purpose that had not been there during the early days of the siege. When Jake reached Tunnel Section 12, he found Danny standing in front of a jury-rigged computer terminal that was connected to cables and devices that had definitely not been part of the original colony infrastructure. Look at this, Danny said, and pointed to the screen, which was displaying what appeared to be text in an alien language. I've been working on this for 5 days, and I finally cracked their communication protocols. Jake stared at the screen and tried to understand what he was looking at. The text was scrolling past too fast to read, even if he had been able to understand the alien writing. What am I supposed to be seeing here? Jake asked. It's their tactical communications, Danny replied with a grin that looked crazy in the artificial light. I figured out how to intercept and decode their radio traffic. Jake, we can hear everything they're saying to each other. Jake felt his heart start beating faster as he began to understand the implications of what Danny had accomplished. If the humans could monitor Vorthak communications, they would know about enemy troop movements and attack plans before they happened. How long have you been able to do this? Jake asked. Since yesterday morning, Danny said. And Jake, you're not going to believe some of the stuff they've been saying about us. Danny touched a control on his terminal, and the scrolling text was replaced by a recording that had been translated into English. The voice that came through. The speaker's was obviously alien, but the words were clear enough to understand. Command, this is Patrol Leader Vexiton requesting immediate extraction from Sector 7. My unit has suffered 30% casualties in the last 6 hours, and morale is approaching critical levels. Another voice responded, and Jake could hear tension in the alien words, even through the translation software. Patrol Leader Vexiton extraction is not authorized at this time. You will continue operations as ordered. Command, with respect, these humans are not fighting like any enemy we have encountered before. They appear to have no regard for their own survival, and they are using tactics that violate standard combat doctrine. My soldiers are requesting reassignment to units that are not engaged with human forces. Jake and Danny looked at each other, and Jake could see that the young tech specialist was just as shocked as he was by what they were hearing. The Vorthak forces were not just having trouble with the battle, they were actually afraid of fighting humans. Danny played another recording that had been made just a few hours earlier, and this one was even more disturbing. Fleet Marshal. This is Ground Commander. Zorhak reporting from the main advance position. Sir, I must formally request permission to withdraw my forces from direct contact with human defenders. Ground Commander, explain your request. Sir, the human forces are exhibiting behavior patterns that our combat psychologists cannot explain. They continue to fight even when faced with certain death. They appear to view their own casualties as acceptable losses in ways that suggest psychological abnormalities. My troops are reporting stress symptoms that are affecting combat effectiveness. Jake heard Fleet Marshal Corex's voice respond, and even through the alien translation, he could tell that the commander was losing his patience with his subordinates. Ground Commander, you will continue the assault as ordered. These humans are a primitive species with minimal training and obsolete equipment. Your forces outnumber them 50 to 1. Yes, sir, but sir, they don't fight like they know they're outnumbered. They fight like they think they can win, and that's impossible given the tactical situation. Sir, I believe we may be dealing with a species that has evolved different psychological responses to combat stress. Danny stopped the recording and looked at Jake with an expression that was part excitement and part horror. There's hours of this stuff, Danny said. Jake, they're terrified of us and they don't understand why. Listen to this one. The next recording was from a Vorac field medic who was treating wounded soldiers, and his report was even more revealing than the combat communications medical. Command, this is Field Surgeon Colmark requesting guidance on treating combat stress reactions in my patients. I have 17 cases of soldiers who are exhibiting what can only be described as primitive fear responses to human combat behavior. Field Surgeon, please elaborate. The affected soldiers report that humans continue fighting even after sustaining injuries that should incapacitate any rational being. They describe human defenders who advance towards superior firepower, while screaming vocalizations that appear to have no tactical purpose. Several of my patients have requested medication to suppress their natural survival instincts. Jake realized that he was listening to the sound of an alien military force slowly falling apart under the psychological pressure of fighting an enemy they could not understand. The Vorac forces had been bred and trained to fight opponents who followed logical tactical patterns, but humans kept doing things that made no sense from an alien perspective. The final recording that Danny played was from Fleet Marshal Corex himself, and it was a conversation with someone who was obviously his superior officer, somewhere else in the galaxy. High Command, this is Fleet Marshal Corex, requesting additional psychological warfare specialists and combat stress management personnel. Fleet Marshal, explain the nature of your request. High Command, the human defenders are employing what can only be described as terror tactics against my forces. They appear to be willing to die rather than surrender, and this is having a detrimental effect on troop morale. Fleet Marshal, you are reporting that a primitive species is using terror tactics against Vorac forces. That is correct, High Command. These humans fight like death seekers. They show no concern for their own survival when their community is threatened. My combat analysts believe we may have encountered a species that has not evolved beyond its most primitive aggressive instincts. Jake felt something cold in his stomach as he listened to the alien commander trying to explain human behavior to his superiors. The Vorac Empire had conquered dozens of worlds and hundreds of species, but they had never encountered anything like humanity. They're not just losing the battle, Jake said to Danny. They're losing their minds trying to figure out why we won't quit. Danny nodded and switched off the recording equipment. Jake, there's something else, he said. I've been monitoring their logistics communications and they're having supply problems. Not because we're stopping their shipments, but because their own units are requesting equipment they don't normally need. What kind of equipment? Medical supplies for treating anxiety disorders. Psychological evaluation teams. Replacements for officers who are requesting transfers to non-combat assignments. Jake, I think their whole military structure is starting to break down because they can't handle fighting an enemy that doesn't behave the way they expect. Jake looked around the tunnel where they were standing and thought about all the people who were still fighting, even though they knew they were probably going to die. Men and women and even children who had decided that some things were more important than staying alive. Danny, can you patch me into their command frequency? I think so. Why? Because it's time to let them know that we've been listening. Jake paused in his testimony and looked directly at Commander Zexkar, who had been listening without interruption for the past hour. The alien's expression had changed during the story, and now there was something in those yellow eyes that might have been understanding or might have been fear. You want to know what happened next, Jake said. You want to know why the most powerful military force in this part of the galaxy retreated from a single human colony that should have been conquered in a matter of hours. Commander Zexkar nodded, But he did not speak, and Jake could tell that the alien was beginning to realize that this story was not going to end with human surrender and Vorthak victory. Danny patched me into their command frequency, and I spoke directly to Fleet Marshal Corex. Jake continued. I told him that we had been monitoring their communications from the beginning, and that we knew exactly how much trouble his forces were having with our defense. Jake remembered that conversation perfectly because it had been the moment when he realized that humans really were different from every other species in the galaxy, not better or worse necessarily, just completely alien in ways that made other races uncomfortable. The Fleet Marshal asked me what we wanted, and I told him the truth. Jake said. We wanted him to leave our home and never come back. He said that was impossible because the Galactic Council had authorized the annexation of human territories, and he had orders to complete the mission. Jake had expected that response, but what happened next had surprised everyone, including the human defenders, who were listening to the conversation through the colony communication system. I asked him a simple question, Jake said. I asked him how many of his soldiers he was willing to sacrifice to follow those orders. Not how many he could afford to lose, or how many the mission was worth, but how many he was personally willing to send to their deaths. Commander Zexkar leaned forward slightly, and Jake could tell that the alien understood the significance of that question, even if he did not want to admit it. Fleet Marshal Corex did not answer right away. Jake continued. And while he was thinking about it, I told him something that I think changed the way he saw the entire situation. I told him that every single person in New Denver Colony had already decided that they would rather die than live under alien rule, and that we were prepared to keep fighting until the last human was dead. Jake had spoken those words calmly and quietly, but they had been heard by everyone in both armies, and the effect had been immediate and profound. The human defenders had cheered because someone had finally put into words what they had all been feeling since the battle started, but the reaction from the Vorthak forces had been completely different and much more revealing. Their communications went crazy for about 10 minutes, Jake said. Officers were calling their superiors and requesting clarification of orders. Medical personnel were reporting increased stress symptoms among the troops. Unit commanders were asking for permission to withdraw to defensive positions. Jake smiled, but it was not a happy expression because he was remembering all the people who had died to reach that moment. Fleet Marshal Corex came back on the frequency, and he sounded different, Jake said. He asked me if I was speaking for all the human defenders, and I told him that I was speaking for every man, woman, and child in the colony. Then he asked me a question that I think revealed everything about how aliens think compared to humans, Commander. Zexkar was completely still now, and Jake could tell that the alien was hanging on every word of the story. He asked me what we hoped to accomplish by fighting to the death, Jake said. He wanted to know what we thought we could achieve by refusing to surrender, when surrender was the only logical choice. And I realized that he genuinely did not understand why we were willing to die for something that had no practical value. Jake had tried to explain it to the Fleet Marshal, but he was not sure that any alien could really comprehend what humans meant when they talked about freedom and dignity and the right to make their own choices about how to live. I told him that we were not fighting to accomplish anything, Jake said. We were fighting because fighting was who we were. We were fighting because the idea of giving up was worse than the idea of dying. We were fighting because that's what humans do when someone tries to take away everything we care about. The silence that had followed that explanation had lasted for almost 30 minutes. And during that time, Jake had watched through his scope as the Vorthak forces began to pull back from their advanced positions around the colony. Fleet Marshal Corex called. Me one more time, Jake said. And he told me something that I think explains why your people are so afraid of humans. He said that in 3,000 years of galactic warfare, the Vorthak Empire had never encountered a species that preferred death to defeat. Jake had not known how to respond to that statement, because from a human perspective it seemed obvious that some things were worth dying for, but apparently that was not obvious to aliens who had evolved different priorities and different ways of thinking about survival. The Vorthak fleet withdrew from New Denver System 6 hours later, Jake said. Not because they had been defeated militarily, but because Fleet Marshal Corex had decided that conquering humans was not worth the cost in Vorthak lives and sanity. Commander Zexkar had been taking notes throughout Jake's testimony, but now he set down his writing instrument and stared across the table with those strange yellow eyes. The retreat was not reported as a defeat, the alien said carefully. Official records indicate that New Denver Colony was determined to be of insufficient strategic value to justify continued operations. Jake laughed, and this time there was genuine amusement in the sound because he had expected that the aliens would never admit what had really happened. Of course, it wasn't reported as a defeat, Jake said. How do you explain to the Galactic Council that your most experienced military force ran away from a bunch of farmers and miners who refused to be reasonable about being conquered? Commander Zexkar did not answer that question, but Jake could see in his expression that the alien understood exactly what he meant. There's something else you need to understand, Jake said. New Denver was not a military colony. We were not trained soldiers or experienced fighters. We were ordinary people who just wanted to build a life for ourselves on a world that nobody else wanted. If a random group of human civilians could make the Vorac Empire retreat, then what do you think would happen if Earth decided to go on the offensive? Jake could see that his words were having an effect on Commander Zexkar and probably on whoever else was listening to this conversation from other parts of the galaxy. That's why you're really here, isn't it? Jake said. That's why I'm sitting in this room talking to representatives from 12 different species. You're not trying to understand what happened at New Denver. You're trying to figure out what to do about the fact that humans exist. Commander Zexkar was quiet for a long time before he finally spoke. What would you recommend? The alien asked. Jake thought about that question, and about all the people who had died defending their home against an enemy that should have been able to crush them, without any effort at all. I'd recommend that you leave us alone, Jake said. We don't want to conquer your worlds or rule your people or interfere with your governments. We just want to be left alone to live our lives the way we choose to live them. But if you force us to fight, we will keep fighting until one of us is extinct, and I don't think you want to find out which one that would be.